repeat again, we're so thrilled to have so many of you. Welcome to the Lanesville Community Center. I'm Valerie Nelson on the board of the center, along with Carol and Jennifer. And this is an exciting program for us to present to you. So I've handed out a sort of work assignment, I said, is to study the program and look at the actual words that really embody the themes of what we're going to experience and celebrate and hear about today. Since 2018, the Lanesville Community Center and partners, including Cape Ann Finns and Gloucester Culture Initiative and others, have focused a lot of research and performances around the Finnish-American culture from maybe 1900 up through 1940, 50. And the first one was in 2018. Many of you went to those events, I'm sure, and have those programs. This is a very lengthy program. It was almost a 3-hour event, lots of photos, and it was a delight to experience the music, sing Finlandia at the end together, and learn about all the musicians in particular who had grown up here and gone on to real substantial careers in music. In 2019, we had a program around Finnish-American theater. We worked with Sarah Clark as a director around her leading actors. Carl Pulkkinen is here, one of those, and Carl, in both classic Finnish plays and also a Finnish-American play, and showing the full extent of comedy and lessons about class structures as well, one might say. And that was a great, enjoyable event. And then in 2022, there was at City Hall, The People Danced program with Sarah Slifer-Swift. Susie Natty was a great help, and uncovering not only photos again, but also getting many Finns and non-Finns out on the City Hall floor dancing the classic Finnish dances. So we've covered again music, we've covered theater, and we've covered dance. And not only the themes of them, but also the ways that they were highly social and participatory events in the Finn halls over such many decades. So what's exciting for us now is to go from, and this is what I gave you to study in the program, is to go from our total immersion in such deep immersion here locally and in general in the culture of the Finn halls and the Finnish-American immigrants into the relationship of those cultural activities on a daily basis with the the development of a community orientation and a looking out for each other and activism in cooperative stores and unions. So it's this swirl, if you look of how culture related, it reflected the lives of the Finnish-American immigrants, and it empowered and for children provided lessons on what important things about life, you needed to learn. So that's what we're going to focus on now. As I said, I'm really excited about it. And also about the two main presenters and performers here. So as the Finns did, and a classic Saturday night might have poetry, a choir, a band, kind of a lecture, a play, vignette, and then a dance, so they blended lectures even with the culture. So we're delighted to have Michael O'Leary here with us, who has been researching some of the Finnish quarry workers' songs and poems in particular, and is going to sing some of those and speak some of those. And at the end of the program, we'll join with him in the very, very famous Viola Turpinen on Cape Ann song that was written. And she was a very famous accordionist who, and one of our Rockport Finns wrote a pretty famous song about her visit here. So we'll sing that at the very end. And Michael, for those of you who haven't been involved with his music here, he's been for about 30 years leading primarily Celtic, but other kinds of folk traditions, and singing on the Ardell and other things like that, and major events around the local singing and folklore of Cape Ann, Salton Sea, I guess is what he says. And then our main lecturer actually, to really weave this swirl, is the word she gave to it, of culture with activism, is Hilary Joy Virtanen, who couldn't be here in person, but she will be here on Zoom. And all of this, by the way, will be recorded. So we'll be able to look at it again. And she will give a lecture, then we'll end with some music. And then we will have a Q&A with all of you. If you'd like to ask questions of either of them, we'll provide that at the end. And I want to say that I've been very determined to bring Hilary here. I knew of her broad interests and expertise, but I just looked up her curriculum vitae from where she was as an associate professor at Finlandia University. So let me just read her areas of interest as to why she's the perfect lecturer on the swirl of culture and activism. Her areas of interest include folklore and cultural anthropology, Finnish and Nordic ethnicities, festivals, Upper Peninsula studies, languages of Finland, epic poetry, mythology, labor lore, folk dance, national dress traditions, oral history, museum studies, and audio preservation. And then a recent publication which is about the swirl of activism, Let the Blood Roses Grow, Workers' Worldviews in the Performances of Oren Deaconen, published in Culture Work Folklore for the Public Good. So I have no idea what she's going to say, and I'm probably as excited as all of you to hear about our whole way of life and our culture, what still has an echo to this day in all of you and in the Lanesville neighborhood. So again, welcome all. And what I'd like to say is we do have Nissu and also a Swedish almond cake from Spear and Hull. So feel free at any time you'd like to get up and get some miso or cake and coffee or water if the spirit moves you now, during, or after the event. And so now, Michael, thank you.
This is a song of hammer, peen, and drill, of half round wedge and reel and chalk line shell. The song the brawny paving cutter sings, as all day long his swinging hammer rings. Someday my blocks will pave a city street, and over them will trip the children's feet, and they will stand aware of heavy load. When I am walking heaven's golden roads, I sing the wit to know the granite's grain, to tell the rift from lift and tell it plain, of how much swing to give to heavy sledge, how many blows to strike the splitting wedge. I sing the ring of I sing the dee-da-da of fitting reel, the harmony that comes from stone and steel, as to his blocks he gives the final blow and piles them in the neatly finished rows. This is a song of hammer, peen, and drill, of half a round wedge and reeling chalk-lined shell. The song the brawny paving cutter sings, as all day long his swinging hammer rings. All day long his swinging hammer rings. All day long his swinging hammer rings. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here, to do this, to be asked to be part of this, to be able to share these pieces with you. Which the origin is, it's not that I'm studying Finnish quarry worker songs, but the origin of all this, I'll try to make it quick, is last summer there was a quarry art photography exhibit at Cape Ann Museum, and as part of that, David Arnold, who organized that, was asked to put on programs, as the museum does. And for one of the programs, he wanted to make it more multidisciplinary, not just photography. So he reached out to me and asked me to do, be a part of it somehow. I had no idea what I was going to do. Myself and my harp playing friend, Carol McIntyre. And one of my first thoughts was to find some poetry that I could set to music, which is something my brain likes to do. And I reached out to Leslie Bartlett, and man, he came through. And he gave me, one time we were at the museum for something else, and he walks up to me and he says, "Here you go." Here's, I'm like, and it was that poem and another one I'm going to do at the end. And that poem was by F.L. Dudley, as written in 1924, or published in 1924, in the Paving Cutters Journal, which was published right here in Rockport. Well, Rockport, where right. I think of it all as one, but especially up in quarry territory. Yeah, so the Paving Cutters Union was, I believe, based in Rockport, and their publication was based here. And somehow Les found those. He hasn't told me quite where he got them yet, but so that's one of them. And it's just, what a wonderful piece, and to share. And that is a paving stone, and it came out of Main Street in Gloucester. And something Les said, I had an idea of doing something like that with it, and Les said, I can get you a hammer, I can get you a paver. And I was like, great. And one day I was walking back from downtown. I live on the edge of downtown. I was walking at Main Street last summer around the who was the guy? Blackburn Tavern, right? And that last summer they had it all dug up. National Grid was putting in a new pipe and all. And I'm walking home and I see this stack of granite blocks. And at first my brain went, what the heck are they doing here? And then I was like, oh my God. Those were paving stones that were in the street. And they were still there. And they had dug them up. So they were stacked neatly, and appropriately they were stacked right in front of the Blackburn building. I mean, it's like right from that era. And the top edge of it, Martin pointed this out to me, because it was all dirty, and the top edge of it is worn smooth from all the traffic over it for so many years. So anyway, so it's not F.L. Dudley, that's not a Finnish name, so sounds more Scottish, Irish, but anyway, sentiment, the imagery, I'm sure would be much shared by the Finnish quarry workers. I'm going to read a couple of poems and then do another one sung. And this is actually a poem that also Leslie gave me later. And this was published, it's by Joseph Evans. It was in the Granite Cutters Journal, published out of Quincy, Massachusetts in 1919. And it's called My Little Granite Hammer. And it relates to the theme that Valerie wanted to stress about the unions and people coming together. And this is a poem about, you can tell he's in the union. He's a granite cutter. And he's like, why can't all the unions get together in one big happy union instead? Because there was competition and apparently tension. You'll pick up on that in the poem. So I've a little granite hammer which I carry in my kit, a little 3-pound dandy, and I've used it quite a bit. All the way from Maine to Frisco and from Georgia to the pole, my little granite hammer is a comfort to my soul. I have laughed at sandstone fellows with a clumsy wooden maul and a hammer like a coffin, but they get there after all. And the marble cutter joins me with his automatic tool, but we'll all get on together if we share the golden rule. It's a grand old trade we follow if a feller does his part. Though his tools may slightly differ, there's no difference in his heart. And I wonder why the dickens we should carry different cards when we might all be together as we should be, loyal pards. You can do a bit of my work, I can do a bit of yours. There should be no wall between us, making enemies and bores. Let us join our separate forces, nail our colors to the wall, and hail each other brother with one union over all. We have Duncan, we have Blasey, we have Griggs and Walter Price. We have brains enough to guide us, and we ought to cut some ice. We can cut down our expenses and our troubles quite a few if we only get together in a brotherly GU, which I take to mean Grand Union or Great Union. Anyway, Joseph Evans. And this is a poem more contemporary. I was given this by Ramona Latham at Halibut Point State Park, because I went to her as part of this quarry thing last summer. I just immersed myself in the history of the quarries and Cape Ann granite and geology. It was just amazing. I'd always been interested in it, but never like I got into it last summer. So I went up to get the tour there. Anyway, she said, "Oh, I got a poem." I told her what I was doing. She said, "I got a poem for you." So this is written by Marty Luster, who it was originally published in Good Morning Gloucester in April of 2012 with a photo he took. And he had recently moved here. He is a retired attorney. I don't know if he's still living here, and his wife, but he said he just retired and was living in central New York and then came to live in Gloucester. And he had a photograph, and he's got a website when he likes to take photographs and then write poetry to go them. So this was called Babson Farm Quarry. It's been many years since the last man was blinded by steel from a hammer or sliver of stone. It's been a long time since a hand or an arm was blasted away at the Babson's Farm Quarry. It's been many years since our bedrock was cut for bridges and buildings and roadways and streets. It's been a long time since steam engines have fired, when monuments shaped from our granite rose tall. It's been many years and the hammers are silent. Cutting and hauling and lifting are done. It's been a long time and the workers are resting. This gift they bequeathed us, this jewel in the sun. So I'll finish with the second piece that Leslie given to me that I set to music, and this one's by Duncan Fletcher. And in that poem, the one I just read before, he talks about we have Duncan. And I'm like, well, could it be the same Duncan that's in this? Probably not, but this one is called also. That first poem I sang is called The Paving Cutter. This is also titled The Paving Cutter, and it was in the Journal in 1930, so a few years later. Knotted brown fingers, all worn at the tips, by drilling and dressing and picking up chips. Firm as their grasp when a handle they feel, and steady the blow when directing the steel. Simple and powerful and strong are the hands, all brown cutting, paving in hot foreign lands. The joints are enlarged and the knuckles protrude by constantly grasping hard handles of wood. Constantly grasping hard handles of wood. Though youthful the eyes, they are wrinkled with fun, and peering at rocks through the dazzling sun. A Boulder of granite with ease he can lift, to tell at a glance the head and the rift. Superfluous fat has no place on the bones of the man whose vocation is wrestling stones. Simple his pleasures, wants they are few, granite that's solid and tools that are true. Granite that's solid and tools that are true. Thank you. Thank you. It's not lost on me, but I'm presenting these right next to Barbara Urkela's memorial stone on the floor. I never met her, but I've certainly come to appreciate her and what she contributed to the history. So I'm going to turn it over to Hilary, and I'm going to try to segue by referring to something in that song I just sang, where he says, I almost have to sing it to remember the lyrics. Though youthful the eyes, they are wrinkled. And when I first look, every time I sing it, it still surprises me. They are wrinkled with fun and peering at rocks through the dazzling sun. So it's like they had their priorities straight. It's like the fun and the work, and the fun went before the work. So I think she's going to talk to someone about that. So that's my segue. So here's Hilary, who's already been introduced. Hi, Hilary. Welcome. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. And Michael, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. So I was hoping I would get to be there in person, but I've had a whole bunch of wacky things go on the past couple of years, and so I'm not. I also did just want to mention that I have a head cold or some allergies or something, so hopefully I sound like I make sense, and hopefully I don't look like a sniffly mess. So I wanted to thank Valerie and Mike and Michael and everybody who made this possible, and I'm just going to talk about a swirl of culture and activism, Finn Halls and the American experience. And I'm going to see if I can share a screen so you can look at some pictures. Oh, I can't. Mike, if it's possible for me to share a screen, that would be super. I'm sorry, I should have asked for that at the sound check. But I'll say as I'm waiting for a second that the intent of this talk is really to kind of capstone the really great work that you all have been doing with your May Day celebrations the past several years. I'm not an expert on Lanesville history, per se. It's a part of the broader, thank you so much, Finnish-American history that I'm interested in. And you already have some excellent, wonderful historians and storytellers of your community. So I certainly want to hop in and pretend to be like Les Bartlett, for instance. So who's amazing, and hi if you're there. But yeah, so I'll be talking about a swirl of culture and activism, Finn Halls and the American experience. So this will be about how the works that your community did in Finn Halls and creating this community is quite a similar story to the works that people across Finnish America and Canada and other expatriate communities around the world really did in order to help create a space for Finnish people to succeed in their new backgrounds, and in order to ease some of the oppressions and difficulties that they faced coming into this new world with new rules and different people. So hopefully it is enjoyable. But first, a little anthropology, because I am an educator and I like that sort of thing. When I look at social organizations and groups and how and why they function, I like to remind students or people who get trapped listening to me over Zoom or wherever that when we were kids, maybe 6 years old or 7 years old, we learned that there was this kind of hierarchy of needs that we had, and that some very basic needs were required just to live, and these included food, clothing, and shelter. I also would say that in order to live, we also have these really important social needs that actually intersperse with food, clothing, shelter, and other things, but that they are definitely one of the basic needs you have. I mean, people can't live alone and people can't be alone. Even if we're loners, we do still need help and company and, society sometimes. And so this is something that the hall culture really does feed into, is not just these basic needs that people are going to be looking for, especially within the labor movement and the left political movements and the co-op movement, but also that they were making sure that people's social needs were being met as well. And that's really, really incredibly important. Culture as a practice that different groups and communities have, and that isn't a unilateral thing, is basically the ways that people respond to these needs and create kind of interesting and differential and beautiful responses to needs. And culture, it's dependent on the environment, on the belief systems that people have, on the availability of resources that people might have to do these things. And, you can just imagine very basic differences between the typical home of a Mongolian herding family, an Irish college student, and a retiree in Florida, just to get an idea about how culture and the resources that a culture has are going to create those responses to the needs that we have, right? Different homes, for instance, different clothes, et cetera. But, these things are all going to feed into the Finnish-American experience. So Finnish immigration to the United States and other places primarily happened in order to meet needs. I think it's probably an idea that people can get behind is that typically people, unless they're sort of adventurers or vagabonds, aren't just going to move if there aren't factors that are saying, hey, maybe you do need to leave. If things are generally comfortable and people are doing well, they're typically not just going to take off and go. Things were not going very well for a lot of our ancestors from Finland and a lot of the, Finnish immigrants who created Finnish American culture in Finland when they had to leave. There were a lot of factors, including the fact that Finland at the time was a class society. There was the haves who were born into being the haves, and there were the have-nots who were the vast majority of the population and were born into having not and could expect to have not for the entirety of their lives. There was this transition from agriculture to industry that was happening that was causing a lot of weird shakeups with the class system, which kind of culminates with things like countries turning into democratic republics, countries going into communist revolutions and so forth. There was this transition, a very long-term transition that happens where Finland goes from being owned by Sweden and being just kind of the Western part of the Swedish Empire with different social structures, language, religion, culture, and so forth attached to that, to being a part of the Russian Empire for a little over 100 years, which also caused some very important shifts that directly led to Finland's independence later. And then later to Finland as this independent state. So there's a lot of kind of upheaval going on and a lot of uncertainty going on in Finland at this time that's contributing to the idea that, hey, maybe it would be good for us to go somewhere else. One of the other terrible things was between 1868 and about 1893, every time Finnish peasants turned around, there was a famine. And these famines were terrible. In 1868, thousands upon thousands of people died of starvation because there wasn't enough food being produced to just support everybody. So Finland was a very tough place. It's very, very different from the place that people, if you've been to Finland nowadays, you're like, gosh, this is not the Finland that these people left in 1890s, 1910. Very, prosperous, happiest country on earth and so forth. 120, 150 years ago, not so much. So, famine, poverty, and short lifespans in Finland are also contributing to the idea that, hey, maybe we have to meet our needs elsewhere. And this, with the idea of like people being pushed out of their country, these pull factors from other countries saying, hey, we have jobs that we need filled, et cetera. There's free land you can take under homesteading laws and so forth, causes these kind of pull factors for Finns to come to the United States in the first place. So Finns get over here. And of course, the ones who come here, they need to work. They get these jobs a lot of times in these very, very tough industries, working in the quarries right there in Lanesville, working in the forests in the, upper Midwest and also on the West Coast. Having farms in Georgia was something groups of Finns did. And of course, working in the copper mines in my own region. This is all tough labor that wasn't exactly an easy transition, but at least it did provide a means for feeding your family. At least there was the idea that it's probably going to stay consistent for a while, that we can go take these stones out of this quarry and have them sent off to be made into other things. We can dig this copper out of the earth and turn it into something else. Someone else can do that and we'll get a paycheck for it. So, Finns, like any other worker, engaged in work to earn wages and to improve their standings. And as the poems and songs that Michael O'Leary sings share, they took pride, they took interest in the work that they were doing. And the fact that, you've got these stones that were cut decades upon decades ago that are still seen within your streetscapes, that are still being kind of dug up as the local landscape changes, is a testament to the work that these people did. They did a good job. They cared about their work. And they thought it wasn't unreasonable to be cared about by their employers. And I think this is something that, this is always a concern for workers everywhere. So these individuals come in, they take these jobs, and this isn't just Finns, these are people from a variety of places around the world. And a lot of them didn't already speak English. And so they're coming in at the kind of lowest rung of the social scale. They had to band together with their co-ethnics in order to just kind of survive and make it and make sure that they were getting the best possible life that they could under these highly marginalizing circumstances. So these are the kind of things that Finns are looking at. And of course, all of the working people who are in these earlier industries where it was a lot easier to be exploited and taken advantage of, and even, dying on the job. Hall culture winds up being a response to these needs. And so hall culture creates this platform for shared sentiments and action. It created this platform whereby people who are singing the songs, like we just heard, and thinking the thoughts that these songs convey, have a place to get together and say them. You certainly couldn't say them on the job in front of your boss without having some trouble, right? And so halls start being developed in order to help people, Finnish people in this instance, to meet basic needs that couldn't be met in a lot of different ways in American society. This included the educational needs. A lot of these halls had lending libraries people could use. Some of them had publishing wings. There was the interpersonal network where you could meet people, perhaps create friendships. There would be social connections. Hey, I need somebody to do this. Oh, I know a guy. Hey, this person is a good doctor, and so forth. There was going to be a location for arts, another interpersonal need to share excellence and share beauty and share strengths and talents that people have that have no other avenue for sharing. And then, of course, there was love. People fell in love in the halls. And, some people might have grandparents or parents with really cute stories about dancing to someone like Valerie Virtanen and, you're having like a 70th wedding anniversary years later, right? Economic needs could be met through the halls as well. So you would have cooperatives, you would have labor unions, you would have different kind of aspects of commerce operating through halls and being promoted through halls. So these were very, very important ways of helping to ensure that immigrants who were making their own lives in the United States and Canada and so forth had a better chance of economic success than they would just operating on their own and kind of being left to their own devices. Finally, there's this kind of practical aspect that a hall could be, like very base kind of practical. You could use it as an address or sort of a base of operations for clubs and meetings and so forth. Again, you could get advice. So it was kind of like a barbershop or a coffee klatch of its day as well. It was a place where you could get things done that you couldn't get done in other areas, or that would be much more conveniently done through the co-ops net or through the halls networks. So culture comes out of what Arthur William Hoagland called the associative spirit of Finns. Finns wanted to get together. They knew that, individually they didn't have much power. Standing as individuals, they didn't have much power, but if they got together, they could make some changes. Little fingers to a fist. It's a little union joke. But so this hall culture then is responding to these needs that people are seeing in everyday life, in the workforce, in different intersocial situations that they're having in the United States. One of the things that was very important about the halls is that they provided a safe haven for thoughts. Not every thought that a person might have back in the day or even today could be considered safe, right? A lot of censorship happened in the United States that isn't quite as prevalent today. And so in the halls, you could talk with people and say things that you might not feel comfortable saying around other people, or that could be actually quite dangerous to say around other people. This didn't take place in a hall, but this is one of my favorite pictures of workers saying, hey, let's take a break and do something radical. So they had their picture kind of in a communistic pose. But, they go to explore things, to learn things through the lending libraries, through people coming and giving speeches, through people doing these talks and sharing this information, and also to express themselves. And so if you were to have a performance night, for instance, in the halls, this could be a platform for creating a bigger political presence or bigger social presence outside of the building and among other Finns. So it's a place to kind of kindle ideas and to kindle new thoughts and new movements and to help them grow both inside and outside. Physical and cultural development are also these key aspects of hall culture. And so you see a lot of the things that have been covered in the previous May Day celebrations and today as well. This idea of performing. You could go and have plays, speeches, musical performances, dances. This is a way for people to share their excellence within a cultural community that's going to understand and enjoy and appreciate and want to take part in these things. Athletics was also a very important part of hall culture, which I've always found very fascinating. The idea that you could have maybe a wrestling club or calisthenics classes or all these different things, and people would actually compete. You would find across these networks that Finnish Americans create through their halls and through the affiliations their halls maintain, over time to compete with other groups, regionally or perhaps even nationally, if you could get across. So these athletic performances are not just ways of having people kind of share, but also to grow in different ways, to physically grow. And, a lot of these folks that are doing this are, of course, people who might have worked a big, long day, but, playing a little basketball or doing some wrestling in the off time is something that is still enjoyable. And so they use the opportunity to do this. Finally, this kind of idea of group and personal improvement. People were coming together to share craft and to share talent and to share practices that's not going to just improve themselves, but improve other people. So there's this group spirit of being on a team or being in a group of performers and having everybody become better at what they do through these developments that they do in performance and in practice. This aspect of the hall culture is what I would call the roses. You've got work and education being the bread, the thing that's developing you and allowing you to kind of survive. But roses are the beautiful part of being a part of movement and being part of a group. And they're equally important to maintaining social connections, personal well-being, and personal development beyond just the 9 to 5 grind or the, 9 to 9 grind as it was back then. So these activities that halls sponsored were extremely important to social development and to personal development for members of the halls themselves. They also wind up then being this springboard for action. And so in the halls, you have people talking about the things that they like to do, the things that they want to see happen, the ways that they'd like the world to positively change. In the hall, though, too, you could step out after having these talks, making plans, having to respond to terrible things happening, perhaps, and go out and use the energy from within to go out and try to make something better for people. Sometimes, of course, this is with varying success, right? I'm from the copper country of Michigan, which in 1913 to 14 had a very catastrophic strike in the copper mines here. At first, it was looking good for the workers. Right around June 22nd or so of 1913, the strike was called by the Western Federation of Miners, and they managed to shut down the entire copper mining system up here. Like, people were on board. And this happens through hall talk. This happens through people having union reps come in from different parts of the country and say, hey, look, one person isn't going to be able to fight the oppressive things that the mine wants to do now. But if you band together, you have a leverage, whether or not they want to acknowledge that. So, the actions start coming out of these different halls. This picture here on the lower right is actually two pictures of two buildings that were built right next to each other. It's what one of my colleagues, Gary Kaunanen, kind of talks about as being like the most kind of radical block in all of Hancock, Michigan, and perhaps for a time in all of Finnish America. This is where the Tunesmith paper was published from about 1910 to 1914, when after the strike, they were forced to move to Superior, Wisconsin. Adjoining on the side and right around the corner from Tunesmith is the Kansankoti Cafe and the Yossi Society, which was a group that supported workers and supported left ideas, and was also highly important during the strike and later during the early days of World War I, when the very first national draft system came about. And a lot of people said, we don't think we want to fight this war. This doesn't have anything to do with us. So it ended up becoming a important center for people to plan what to do in opposition to the war itself. These places were originally created just with Finns in mind, right? I mean, yes, it's a Finnish word. It means workman. It was a Finnish language newspaper. It was specifically created for Finns, but they find over time that in collaboration with the two main unions who came in, the Industrial Workers of the World and the Western Federation of Miners, to help serve the striking miners, that they could actually help people outside of their ethnic community. And so for a time, Tunesmith also published during the strike another paper in English so that it could reach a wider range of strikers and help to share the information that the Finnish people were gathering themselves. So this collaboration can happen across ethnic lines. And oppression of workers, a lot of times, you might find workers in these kind of communities where they're sort of banding together by ethnicity in a variety of ways, both in work assignments. For instance, Finns typically got kind of the lowest level work details. People who could speak some English or languages that were closer to English would be kind of higher up the scale, for instance, Germans, Finnish, so forth. But the Finns creating these halls and having this kind of solidarity within themselves once all the workers start to be oppressed, you see solidarity happen across ethnic lines. One of the other things that happens, though, is when a political issue is brought forth within the Finnish community here in the Copper Country, Finnish people start to splinter. At first, like, there is a general sympathy for people who are working, who probably don't deserve to be crushed to death by rocks when they're working, having to kind of come together. But when the strike comes and it actually brings it down to action, you do find that there are some Finnish people who don't support this, and that there is a schism that happens within the community that actually still in some ways exists a little bit to this day up here, which is very strange. It's been 111 years now. So again, these halls create a point of action for Finnish people. Over time, they also do a bit of outreach under kind of very specific circumstances to people outside of the community. And also at the same time, other Finnish people feel alienated from this situation because they don't support the cause of the workers. They have, different ideals and different goals in mind. And so there's a lot of things that happen with action with these halls that ends up actually sometimes resulting in other halls happening. Another important aspect of hall culture that develops among Finns, of course, is this idea of socioeconomic solidarity, which is really well expressed in the Finnish-American co-op system. So in the Midwest, of course, we had something that developed eventually called the Central Cooperative Wholesale, which had huge Finnish support. It was a big deal. It was also situated in Superior, Wisconsin, which is where the tunesmith office moved after the strikes here. And this was the co-ops are actually very fascinated. I mean, I can't tell if everybody in the audience knows like how intensive cooperative movements could be. I think a lot of us are familiar nowadays with the small cooperative store in our neighborhood. You pay a fee, you get kind of higher quality goods, you get sometimes pretty rare stuff. At least up here in the Upper Peninsula where I live, you can find things there that you probably can't find in a lot of other places. But it's not tied to this ethnic ideal nowadays. It's mostly tied to kind of almost like environmental or sort of more different social concerns. But Finns, and particularly Finns in agriculture, when they start living in different parts of the United States and start trying to sell their products on their own, start realizing that they're not getting the best deal that they could. And by creating a cooperative, not only are they able to get a good deal for themselves with sales, but they're also able to create financial support for their members. So everybody, they're paying a fair price, they're being paid a fair price, everybody's benefiting. In my early days of studying Finnish Americans, like 2 decades ago, I actually had the privilege of interviewing a woman who was brought up in the co-op system here in the Upper Peninsula. And I hadn't realized before that it really could be a cradle to grave organization. She had childhood summer camps through her co-op. They had gas stations, they had mechanics. There was even literally to grave a funeral home that was a part of the cooperative. So whatever you needed, a co-op could answer the question and solve it for you in a reasonable price and with, financial gains for everybody. So it's this interesting kind of world that could happen through hall culture, whereby people could organize these highly developed systems to help everybody get the best deal that they could, to help local produce, and also to bring in goods that you couldn't get locally. And up here in the Keweenaw, you couldn't get goods locally. This is a picture actually of the cooperative store in Pelkey, Michigan, which is only about 20 miles away from my house. It was open until 1995, and it opened right around the 1920s. And it was a cornerstone of this very small, rural, remote farming village for decades until it closed. A lot of people had their first jobs there and stuff. So these forms of solidarity that are being created through hall culture end up extending beyond the hall, beyond the social space, into economic spaces, into kind of political spaces, into organizing outside of the hall itself to make sure that people could continue to do better in this American life that they're developing. Finally, and maybe most importantly to some, the co-op or the halls are the places where love can be in the air. Viola Turpeinen, she's world famous, and of course she brings Cape Ann into the knowledge of a lot of other people because of the song that Antti Syrjaniemi wrote about her performance there with you all, with the ancestors of you all. But she was this kind of superstar of Finnish America, and she was very down to earth, and she traveled around. She was actually, her mother is from my community of Toivola, Michigan. So maybe we're distant like cousins-in-law or something. But I put her there because she's playing at these dances. She's performing at all these halls. She gets her start, actually, part of her start was with the Finnish Workers Education Association in New York City. So she worked at a socialist hall in their band, which is pretty interesting, right? Hall culture is so widely developed that they had their own orchestras, including one that had Valerie Virtanen in it. I started realizing the practical love function of halls back in grad school, almost 20 years ago as well. First part of it was when I read an article that was assigned to me in a class by another folklorist named James P. Leary. He had me read an article about courtship practices between Finland and the United States called Yöjuoksu versus the Hall by Ellen Luoma. And in this article, she describes that in Finland, in agricultural Finland, the ways that young people could court in a kind of socially acceptable manner would be to have these kind of promenades during community festivals that took place once a year, right at the end of the harvest. And so it was a way to scope out people that might be good marriage partners and to kind of get to know them a little bit so that you could influence decisions that could be made on your behalf, with or without you, to make sure that you might get a marriage partner that was good. In the United States, this changes, of course, because we don't have religious festivals and agricultural festivals as a system the way that they did in Finland. And so the hall steps in for this. In the hall, people are going to dances, and this is where they're meeting each other. This is where, men and women being segregated in the workforce have an opportunity to see each other, to get to know each other, to size each other up. And also in the United States, without so much parental kind of supervision and without so much community control of people's courtships, you actually had a real chance of perhaps finding a love match or finding that kind of match that a person would want. This also was illustrated to me, the romantic function of the hall and hall dances, especially in 2008 at FinFest in Duluth, Minnesota. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Richard and Helvi Impola. Richard Impola was a very well-regarded Finnish-American English professor, actually at the SUNY New Paltz. It's, New York State's University in New Paltz. He was also a translator into Finnish. So he translated a lot of books into Finnish, and he was very well known on the Finnish-American kind of lecture circuit at that time. And I had met him once before, and I was very starstruck. And so I saw him at this FinFest in 2008, and I didn't even get a chance to say hi to him. I was in a dance hall. I was picking up some sodas for my kids to drink, and he and Helvi came freezing into the room, and I said, Dr. Impola, Mrs. Impola, it's so good to see you. And without even barely looking at me, yeah, Hilary, hi. They went running past me, which, these two were octogenarians at this point. I was very impressed. Went running across the dance floor, sat down, threw on their dance shoes, and within seconds, danced the night away. This idea of the hall being this kind of romantic place where you might find that person you love is something that could be replicated for many, many years in the dance halls. And actually, even in my community here in South Range, Michigan, we do still have the last polka hall in the state that's operating. And so you do still get to see it on Sundays. Actually, it's just ending about now. So this idea of having a place where not only are your needs for maybe unionizing and so forth happening, but meeting friends who are useful, meeting people you're going to fall in love with, all of this social life is just radiating it inside the hall, creating these beautiful swirls of culture and action, and creating the communities that Finnish people had well into the future then. One thing now about us Finns, and maybe some of us know this, is that 2 of us can make an institution, but 3 could easily cause a schism. And so this is very much true about, I would say, Finnish Americans in a lot of places. And I know the fact that you had multiple halls in Lanesville itself can attest to that as well. So if you were in a community, it could be a religious community, it could be a political community or a union and so forth, you didn't always have to stick together if you didn't want to and if it wasn't advantageous to you. This ends up actually being illustrated quite well with Lestadians, Apostolic Lutheran Finns in the United States, really early on in Finnish-American immigration. In the 1870s, there was a group of Lestadian Finns who were attending a church. It was a Lutheran church that at that point was kind of shared by a Norwegian and Swedish pastor. So it was a little tough for Finnish speakers, but they still, they knew the drill. They could make it through the practices. But the Lestadians had a rift with the pastor at that church who no longer allowed them to take communion, which, if you believe in God and communion is an important part of your practice, that can be devastating. So they actually went to court to sue the church And the judge said, okay, so what is this about? And the Laestadians said, we want to sue in order to have the right to have communion. The judge said, well, I mean, if these people don't want to give you communion, why don't you just start your own church? So the Laestadians said, wait, what? And that's, American freedom of religion. You can start your own church. And so they did. And, the communion issue was no longer a problem. And also the causes behind the schism were no longer a problem for either group, because both groups could maintain the practices that they wished to and the beliefs that they wished to promote without there being an issue with everybody within. So this is very much, an early kind of schism. The Central Cooperative Wholesale Organization, which has all these Finnish co-ops between 1929 and 1932, have a schism where they're trying to figure out, there was a faction within the group that was very much interested in communism and wanted to have it be a communist-controlled co-op, whereas other members didn't want that. And so there was a lot of infighting. It did cause the communist leadership within the group to be expelled, and so it changed the nature of the co-op in that way by 1932. Again, a schism. people decide, hey, we're going to do something different here. This American freedom really allows for branching out. And then, of course, you have different organizations that aren't even related to each other per se. You have Suomi College, or Finlandia University, where I used to work, and the Työmies building, just less than a mile down the street. Very, very different approaches to the strike. Suomi College did not approve of the strike, and so did not support strikers. Strikers felt hurt by the fact that their country people weren't standing up for them, and it did cause a lot of rifts for many, many years. But you can see this across the wide spectrum of the type of halls. Now, I mostly, for this purpose, have been looking at kind of left-leaning halls, but of course, hall culture is and was replicated through churches. It is replicated through the Knights and Ladies of Kaleva movement, also through socialist and or communist, other types of labor halls, and finally through temperance halls, which, temperance actually was an interesting movement as well among Finnish Americans. There were a lot of people within socialist movements who were interested in temperance, with the idea that alcohol is something that dulls the senses of the worker and prevents them from actually operating in their self-interest. So there's a very strong kind of socialist temperance movement as well. But then also within the temperance movements, there's like, well, we don't want dancing. That's a little bit much. So, causes more schisms, more organizations to be developed as a result. Over time, we move, and we're still continuing to move, from being Finnish to being American in a variety of different ways. With these early Finnish movements with halls, it was really important for Finns to stick together because it was a way for them to have power when otherwise they wouldn't. It was a way where they could use the full strengths of the languages that they already knew to express themselves, to share ideas, and to create movements. It was a very important bridge for people as they're moving from being an immigrant who may or may not return to Finland to being a definite American who's laid down roots, who's not going back to Finland, and whose descendants still live here today. It kind of creates these reconfigurations of how people practice things once you start working with students and you're, as a child and learning English. Once you start meeting people outside an ethnic group who, hey, I have a crush on that person. I'm going to ask them out I'm going to marry them, I might switch my religion because of them, and so forth. These are all factors of life in the United States that a lot of people go through when they move over time. It doesn't make it wrong or bad. I think that one of the interesting things about America is the ways that we take the different cultures that we belong to, take the best practices that our neighbors have, and help make it a part of our own lives in order that our lives can be better. I see this in very big and very small ways in the United States throughout my time. On the left, I've got my friend Pekka Olsen, who's actually teaching me how to wood carve lately. We got these fish called burbot. They're very traditional. Went over to his house and had him make a pie. He made something which is called kalakukko in Finland, but it was very, very different from how a Finn would recognize a kalakukko versus how an American would. He used what we as Americans have as ingredients and resources to create this dish, but it still had a very Finnish affiliation for him. In my own hometown of Toivola too, we have an annual midsummer bonfire, which is very much like the traditional bonfires you see in Finland. It's been going on since about 1894. 130 years. And it's an expression of Finnishness while still being something that you don't have to be Finnish to enjoy. So over time, we do take what we have and we change it. Sometimes this creates new and lasting things, or it keeps things like Juhannus as a way of doing what people have always done. Other times things die out. And of course, we know that hall culture, the way it used to exist, has died out with the shift in language, with political shifts and social shifts that have happened in the Finnish American community. But there are still glimmers of hall culture today. I would ask people, how and where do we see this? Perhaps this is a discussion question that we have. But of course, we know that there are local Finnish organizations such as yours that do create, in some sense, a way to have hall culture continue to this day. So I hope what I'm demonstrating is that hall culture is something that Finns were able to uniquely develop across the United States and across a lot of the places that they moved to in the world, really, in order to make not just a community with themselves at that time, but eventually a bridge toward Americanization. Even though a lot of what we've seen in hall culture has dissipated because of the changing needs of our society and because of the changing ways that people are Finnish today, it still does exist in different ways. And it still is a resource that we can create, associating in different ways, even if it's just online at this point, to help support us as people, help support our neighbors, Finnish or not, in different things that they do, and to help to really celebrate the honorable parts of our heritages that make Finnish American culture a unique thing today. So with that, I'll just say thank you. And I have my email address here. I don't have my Finlandia email address anymore. So if anybody wants to get in touch with me, you can always feel free to email me. And we'll stop my share.
Thank you so much, Hilary. I learned so much. That was so inspiring to hear. So you'll take some questions from the audience, Hilary. Yes?
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I have one first, point of privilege. So we got a little bit in one of the calls into, could you describe a little bit the efforts of the American political system to suppress this activism around cooperatives and unions? I know in my own family background I was told memories of the FBI knocking on doors saying, we'll send your grandmother home to Finland if you don't stop talking about socialism and unions. And that was during the McCarthy era. So my own family experienced the American system suppressing the activities. You mentioned one earlier. Could you talk about how much the political system in this country suppressed, successfully or otherwise, what was going on in the halls?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Finns, one of the things that I would say about Finns is that we don't always like to start fights, but if people want to start with us, we'll try to finish it. And so this is one of the things that you see with the Finnish American labor movement and Finnish American leftist politics is that they were operating for a fair deal. They wanted what the idea of the American dream was supposed to promise. They didn't say that they wanted to do it without hard work, but they wanted it to happen. And they wanted this ideal of fairness that America represented to actually be there when they got there and to continue to be there and grow and develop over time. So, this is the kind of foundational idea behind kind of leftist politics is that everybody should have a fair chance. Everybody should have basic needs met. When I started studying about 6 years ago, I started doing research on a project about World War I. And it was a part of this giant community project. Like Michigan Tech University was doing something. This, library was doing something. All these different foundation or kind of factors are doing something. They knew that I was interested in IWW song lore of the era. And so they said, hey, is there something you could do? And I looked at what everybody else was doing. And I said, I'd like to look at people who didn't like World War I and who thought it sounded like a terrible idea. And, who are these people? You never hear about them. Well, you might be shocked to learn it was the Finns who were at the forefront of this movement. And so in learning this, I did a lot. I read newspaper reports of the day the very first draft happened. It was the first time the draft ever happened in the United States. Everybody had to show up at these given locations in these towns between these, business hours on this one day. And if you didn't, you were going to get in some sort of trouble. And indeed, when it happened and kind of all the dust settled and they realized a whole bunch of Finnish people had not registered, they actually, the earliest versions of what came to be the FBI had a coordinated raid. This took place on September 5th, 1917 at 2 p.m. Central Time across the country. And so what happened was the local little kind of FBI-ish, proto-FBI people went busting into all these halls nationwide. I'm very certain, I haven't found actual proof of it, but I would guarantee that the Kansankoti Hall in Hancock and the Tunesmith newspaper were raided simply because the number of people who 2 days later were forced to sign up for the draft, including Hiski Salama, the very famous Finnish-American musician. Um, so you know, these raids did have consequences. The idea that, you know, Finns were the first people that they suspected, and this is during World War I. Most of the rest of the country was freaking out about German people, thinking that German immigrants definitely were not going to be loyal to their to their new home country, and that, you know, they need to be oppressed and kind of watched over and put in lists, and, you know, even put in jails or moved away from their homes. Finns actually wound up being the primary concern up here, despite the fact that at the time, and still today, the second largest ethnic group in the area is actually German. So you know, there's this kind of strange thing going on where Finns were very much at the first round of people who were being kind of rounded up, harassed, looked after. When World War I ends, you know, J. Edgar Hoover now has like an ounce of power, and we know he kind of liked a lot of power as his thing. He decided the best thing he could do, despite the war was over and the IWW could quit complaining about the war, was to actually just crush the IWW as hard as he could. And so this led to the 1919 Palmer raids, which some people might have heard of. The Palmer raids kind of did the same thing, where they had, you know, a kind of synchronized attack on all these different things over time. And they would go not just to halls, but to people's homes. And so in my own home community of Toivola, Michigan, my friends' grandparents were visited. And they weren't even socialists. They just had tons of friends who were, and were like, you know, yeah, they're cool people. They're nice. They got interesting ideas. Their books were stolen. And that was the funny thing, is in an oral history about this, the father, Walter Salmi, goes, yeah, those guys took a bunch of our books. We never got them back. We didn't even get to read a couple of them yet. You know, he's very upset about that they would want to steal knowledge. Of course, Sirka Holm, who some of you might know of course, she was a New England Finn. She was raided by the House Un-American Committee people, McCarthy people, back in the 1950s. And, you know, people were throwing, like, they were kind of throwing stuff through her window, and it was this very violent attack. So that's kind of this idea that Finns were always seen as being very far to the left. You've got people like Gus Hall, who, you know, was the communist president candidate for years and years and years, being a vocal Finn. So a lot of times in places where they had Finns, whenever stuff started getting a little dicey, they would go straight to them to kind of rough them up a bit. And so I hope, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. So many great stories you have.
Yeah, I'm kind of more like the folklore storyteller.
Right, that's exactly. All right, questions from the floor. Susie, you had one. Yeah, I will. So we learned a lot about the Finn halls. Did other ethnic groups also have halls in this country?
Yes, absolutely. So there were, again, a lot of my experience, of course, comes from the region that I live in, just because it's the local history, right? So there might be examples within your own communities too that you can find. But up here, you would find Italians and Croatians had halls. There were also different kind of like religious groups or religious communities that could have similar functions to halls as well. The most famous hall in the Upper Peninsula is not actually Finnish; it's Italian, and the reason it's famous is for a horrific reason. In 1913, there was something called the Italian Hall disaster with regard to the local strike. This has been immortalized by a song by Woody Guthrie, actually, if you've ever heard 1913 Massacre. And so this hall was actually built by Italian people, and it was a mutual benefit society, which actually the Knights and Ladies of Kaleva had a mutual benefit function. A lot of times cooperative halls and leftist halls would also have this function. It was an early form of insurance. And so they had a hall that they built to kind of help people both socially as well as economically and kind of, you know, practically. So yes, it was pretty common to see actually Croatian, Italian, so forth.
So I think in talking to you, I realized that the only existing hall still on Cape Ann is the Vasa Spirin Hall in Rockport, which comes out of the Swedish heritage. And I'm sure the Swedes and Norwegians on Cape Ann were not union activists the way that the Finns were. The Swedes were more middle. Do you agree with that? But there were also Swedish and Norwegian halls. They just weren't radical union.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Swedish and Norwegian people came a little bit earlier than the primary group of Finns did. And they also, because they spoke a language that was closer to English, it was a little bit easier to them, you know, to kind of pick up some language skills and be able to to acclimate a little sooner.
Have
So,
that middle class. Yes, Michael adds in here that we still do have a Portuguese club.
oh yeah.
The Italian clubs, well, St. Peter's Club, yeah. But I've called it, in some ways, they're shadows of all the activity that there was in the past. Anyone else with a question? Martin? So Martin's question is, you've done a great job of explaining back in the day the Finn halls, and what do you think about a revival of halls to meet the current moment with those kinds of social and political? Should we be trying to recreate halls today?
I think well, I think the greatest difficulty probably with halls is the fact that that kind of ethnic connection that made it something that was very much necessary, or a necessity, has gone down a lot. There's other things now that people have to meet their needs. And the capitalist society, I mean, especially not just the capitalist society, but I would say the social society of the United States, having unemployment, having disability, those kind of things were things that halls actually helped to respond to back in the day. So I think that, I mean, a lot of the very, very base kind of survival functions of these, a lot of them are past, but it doesn't mean that we should forget those, because you only protect your rights and your ability to meet your needs by continuing to defend those rights to those abilities and needs. And so I think that there could be room for those, but I think one of the ways that you see hall culture survive today, of course, is through Finnish ethnic clubs. For instance, like Spiron Hall, which I got to visit last fall, which is a beautiful building. Oh my gosh. But also through the different, like the Finlandia Foundation chapters and stuff. It's a way for people to keep the space open and to make the space work to whatever their needs are at that time. And also to help keep the door open for younger people when they're ready. And we know that, younger people don't participate in groups like that like they used to. But when the time comes and they're ready to kind of determine how they want to go about it, having that space remain open for them gives them that option instead of having to build it from scratch.
So there is a fair amount of interest in activist circles around housing and climate to recreate the hall culture, which is sort of what Martin is getting at, is that
Okay, that's yeah.
And someone like Carl Rockman and Tom Dubois, they would say that it is through block parties and dances that people get to know each other, and certainly a need to counteract some of the private property gentrification issues here. So it's something that Martin and some of the rest of us play with. Can a community center hall do
That's
some of the
interesting.
same, bring
Yeah.
people together through culture, but also embolden and empower them to stand up for their rights in Gloucester, which have to do with things like climate action and affordable
Yeah.
housing. And what is that balance between coming together around the common good versus the private market system that we're kind of contending with. So thank you.
Yeah, I should add to that just a tiny bit. This isn't finished at all, but it's very interesting. And there's a local group actually that it's called the Keweenaw Socialists. It was created by young socialist students at Michigan Technological University, which is actually kind of a surprise if you look at the demographics of the students who attend tech. But they actually set up their own group. They have their own newspaper, which very much resembles different aspects of what old school socialist newspapers looked like. Like I was actually quite impressed that they were able to kind of imitate that style and imitate that kind of format and stuff, but still kind of taking on different forms of journalism that are modern and useful. So there's a lot to be said for keeping these doors open and kind of providing inspiration for future people, because banding together is the only way that social ills and social injustices and social problems can be solved and can even be addressed, really. One person, one little finger, you get 5 fingers, now you got a fist, right?
But also the insight that building that commonality and purpose to look out for each other often is built with cultural activities and dances and poetry.
Absolutely.
So it's that swirling, your term of culture
Yeah.
and action. Question over here. So this is a question about what's going on in Finland. It seems like there may be a lot of interest now in what happened to the immigrants who came here. What lessons are there? Finland has now joined NATO. Is there a lot of scholarship and general interest in this history that you've described in Finland?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I would say, well, I have a ton of colleagues from Finland who study different aspects of what I study as well. So we've got kind of, our own cohort, our own kind of hall, I guess, virtually speaking, as it is. So yeah, one of the things about Finns is that Finland, even though it's the size of Montana, it does only have 5.5 million people, and so they do consider themselves a small country. I've walked around in Finland. I've been on TV in Finland before, actually. And it's not a brag, but I'm just saying that I've walked down the street and had people been like, I saw you on TV. Aren't you that lady from America? And I mean, like bank tellers and stuff. So because it's a small country, they pay a lot of attention to where people left. A giant proportion of Finns left Finland. And so most people have an ancestor who left, maybe a grandparent, a great grandparent further back. But because of that, they know that they have this American family that they're curious about. They know they have grandpas who never came home and they never knew what happened to them. And, maybe they took on a secret, second wife in America. So there's always been that interest. And there's also the interest in the fact that you have, this culture, this Finnish culture, which develops very rapidly in the 1800s in response to it having a form of self-governance under the Russian Empire, and the fact that they realize if we don't create our own culture now, we're going to become a Russian culture as opposed to a Finnish culture. Finnish-Americans, a lot of us are peasants. Like, we came from this background where we weren't the privileged people. We could read. Finland had an amazing literacy rate back then. So we left with like this great linguistic kind of practice and this kind of reading and writing tradition. And so Finnish people seem very, very fascinated by what it is that we took from the culture from home and use over here, and how is it that we've adapted it to our own needs and purposes today. So that comes in a lot of different ways, right? I was actually in Finland the day that they announced they were going to apply to join NATO, and it was really fascinating to see. Finns like to be a part of the world, and when Finland was during the Cold War, when Finland had to be very careful because they were a neighbor of Russia, they had to deny these kind of public institutions and these kind of being a part of the world impulses that they had in order to prevent. You can come in, it's okay. My kids decided to leave for this lecture, but now they're walking in. Just be quiet. No swear words. Sorry. But yeah, so Finns, they like being a part of the world. They like being recognized in the world, and they also like recognizing themselves outside of their own home. And so Finnish-Americans are very exciting to them. Like, I always feel weird when I go over there thinking that, oh, maybe I should call one of my distant cousins. For me, it seems intrusive. And I think for a lot of Americans, it would kind of feel that way. But for Finns, like, well, of course you should. I mean, we're fifth cousins 3 times removed. Why wouldn't you want to meet us? So it's very connective. They enjoy that.
Yes. Do you want to come up and tell us?
On Wheeler Street. And Burnham's Field was running downhill. Burnham's Field was running downhill. It was really in bad shape. Okay. And my father was a beginning contractor. And the city of Gloucester asked my father to be the foreman to rebuild Burnham's Field. And so he hired a lot of people to work there. And he kept an eye on all the workers, kept looking and seeing who were the good workers and so forth. And then he, Bernard was complete. And he hired all the Finns that worked there because they were the best workers.
Mhm.
And that's why he hired him. And that's what made my father's construction company one of the best construction companies on Cape Ann in Massachusetts. Consolidated Construction Company, and it was because of the Finns that made them. And I wanted to share that. And I know as a young kid growing up, before all that happened, or I was old enough to understand, we'd say, oh, you're going to Lanesville. Lanesville? Oh, no way. But the Finns made my father's business, Consolidated Construction Company, Harold Dexter.
That's a wonderful commentary. Thank you for
So
sharing that.
another question maybe, and then we're going to sing together with Michael. Yeah, you had your hand up before. We have a comment that this community center was an Ahola family barn, and 1950s, somewhere in there, Finnish and non-Finnish people came together and established this as our Lanesville Community Center. We like to think that we carry on with cultural events and political debates and, you know, all kinds of action and culture as well. It's not daily like it was back in the day, but yeah, thanks for reminding us of that. You had your hand raised. Right. So this point made was that in Finland, a large portion, maybe a bit more affluent, were Swedish people, and they spoke Swedish. So when the waves of immigration came, did the Swedish Finns come? And when they came, did they bring a more Swedish culture and writings and activities? And so that in terms of where the immigrants came from and whether they had that Swedish Finnish background or straight Finnish, Karelia, et cetera.
Yeah, I would say so. One of the things for Finland Swedes is that you know, they had the option of mixing in with Swedes and Norwegians because of the language. And so a lot of times there's this kind of hidden history of Finland Swedes that people might not recognize. One thing that Finland Swedes themselves did to prevent that was, of course, to create halls. And the most kind of the national one was the International Order of Runeberg. Runeberg was the national poet of Finland, and he and Elias Lönnrot actually went to college together, which was kind of interesting. But yeah, it was a place where Finland Swedes could maintain their own identities and have it be a solid, definite, different identity from Sweden Swedes. You know, and of course, that identity is mixed using Swedish language literature that comes from both sides of the, you know, Gulf of Bothnia. It comes from the ability to really more easily borrow from Swedish and kind of Norwegian language cultures and practices than a Finnish speaking Finn could. So yeah.
So with my father's Swedish heritage, I call them Swedish Finns. You just flip that. So yeah.
Yeah,
That's
and
the
actually, so
Swedish, dominance. Yeah, whatever.
yeah, and I would just say the reason why I do that is actually just because in Finland, that's what they're called is Finland Swedes is like, that means they live in Finland. So actually, if you say Finnish American in Finland, what to a Finnish mind, what it would mean would be an American who's living in Finland. And so they actually say Amerikan suomalaiset, America's Finns.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, all right. So thank you so much, Hilary. Okay. Was that intermarriage here or in Finland? So the genetic studies are showing that Swedish men married Finnish women here. So you can trace that kind of relationship. One last question, Fred. Right. So Fred Peterson has some ancestors from the coast and some from near the Russian border. And you can trace back to which ethnic heritage and genetics they brought with them. So thank you very much, Hilary.
Thank you. And thank you all. This was really fun.
So now, if you remember the photo of Viola Turpinen, this very, very glamorous accordionist who traveled the country and played with her husband, I think was the musician with her, and her famous visit to Cape Ann where, what is the name? Hiskisa? Is that, or who is the Finnish writer of the piece about her visit to Antti Sirjonen? I'm sorry, I forgot that. So records were made and it's quite well known in the Finnish-American community. So Michael, you're going to lead us all in the song about Viola Turpinen's glamorous visit to Cape Ann.
So yes, what's this Irish guy doing singing a Finnish song? Well, I'm actually fulfilling official duties as a Finland ambassador of goodwill. And you're like, no. Yes. So this is my official designation from 1988, Finland's ambassador of goodwill. And the story behind this is that I moved to Massachusetts in 1985. I was living in Cambridge. I think it might have been my very first part-time job. I was an editorial assistant for Eino Freiberg, who translated the Kalevala. And he was the first, if I got this right, he was the first Finnish-speaking person who translated it into English. And he'd been born in Finland and emigrated to the US when he was like 7 years old. He became blind. So he was translating the Kalevala from Finnish from Braille to Braille. So I came into this project late. He pretty much had it done, but he was going over it. So I would go to his house in Belmont, and he was an amazing guy. He was a labor organizer. He was also a minister, and just kind of a Renaissance man. I would go to his house and I would read his translation that he had, and he would sit there and go over the original in Braille to kind of check his work, and then we would make corrections or whatever. And I ended up writing notes for the edition that was published in '88. So much to my surprise, this was sent to me from Finland in April of '88, and it's Finland's ambassador of goodwill without portfolio. The duties entailed in the appointment are as follows. I'll just drop down to the fourth one because I'm executing this duty here with this song I'm going to sing. To exercise every skill and all persuasive power in demonstrating the importance of the Kalevala and of Finland's literature as a whole, to the end that a fruitful cultural relationship may be established between the Finnish and English-speaking people everywhere. So signed by John O. Virtanen, president of the Finnish North American Society, Turku, Finland. So anyway. I'd pretty much forgotten about that. I hadn't looked at that in years, but Valerie and Hilary and I had a Zoom, chat to plan this out, and somehow we got talking about the Kalevala, easy thing to do. And I was telling Hilary about this, and I'm like, yeah, somewhere I have this certificate, and I dug it out, and I took a photo of it and sent it to her. And so anyway, here we go. So this, you're going to get to sing in this. So this is this song that is famous, that is about Viola Tyrppainen's dance at Cape Ann. So she came to Cape Ann and had this raucous, rollicking dance. And Antti Siriniemi wrote this song. And he recorded it in 1929 on the Victor label in New York. And in 1978, what Victor became RCA, they came out with like a greatest hits of Finnish songs and music. And this made the cut, the song. So this is one of the songs on this 1978. And you can, it's on YouTube, but it's also on Internet Archive. And it's fantastic. The quality is really excellent. So, so this is a translation. I don't know, Hilary might have done this translation. Is this your, yes, this is her translation. It's a mouthful in Finnish and it's a mouthful in English. So I had to like, snip some syllables here and there just to kind of fit it in my mouth. Your part, so the last two lines end with hittan tila tula hittanta. Have any of you heard? I was told that at one of these gatherings one year, this was presented in Finnish. I don't know if it was if somebody sang it or it was just a recording. Valerie? It was a recording, right? So, and I'm sure very few people understood the Finnish. Maybe some of you here did, but this is an English translation that kind of, there's 7 verses. I'm going to do 5 of them just to cut it a little bit short. So, hittan, tilatula, hittanta. And it doesn't mean anything. It's just like Irish music has this. There's just vocables, just nonsense. Yeah, just nonsense syllables, but they're great. So, yeah, so that's your part, and I'll cue you, and that comes at the end of every verse. So, Viola Tyrppainen at the dance in Cape Ann. That's in the title. So, I see it now like yesterday when Tyrppainen's daughter did to town arrive. With a catchy tune she started to play. People wondered how they would survive. The accordion rang out from her chest. It went hittan tila tula hittanta. Both the young and old, they danced their best. They went hittan tila tula hittanta. Grandpa danced to the polka beat. The music made him flex from toe to cap. Only 2 old ladies kept to their seats, and even those grannies their toes did tap. As the tempo rose, a girl started panting, said, hittan tila tula hittanta. Hold nothing back, all the others were ranting, said, hittan tula tula hittanta. Like they were hammering, the cobblers did pound, and carpenters danced as if planing wood. Wives and widows were too few to go round, while the girls not married humbly by them stood. It seemed the masons were mortaring lots. They went hittan tila tula hittanta. Blacksmiths stepped like on coal so hot. They went hittan tila tula hittanta. Seldom has a polka gone so fast, and seldom has a floor been packed so tight. Grandma said a breather they needed at last. Dripping from sweat, they were soaked that night. The girl played like on heavenly bells. She went hittan tila tila hittanta. Farmers like haying on slopes and dells. They went hittan tila tula hittanta. Some dancers were tall while others were small, but needed no coaxing to enter the fray, spinning on their backsides while others did fall. To Viola's music every hip did sway. How that girl did play, it brought such delight. She went hittan tan tilla tula hit tan ta. Crawling on the floor by the end of the night, they went hit tan tilla tula hit tan ta. How that girl did play, it brought such delight. She went hit tan tilla tula hit tan ta. Crawling on the floor by the end of the night, they went hit tan tilla tula hit tan ta. Hit tan tula tula hit tan ta. Hit tan tilla tula hit tan ta. Good job. Good singing. Well done.
Oh, thank you all for such a marvelous afternoon. Really appreciate this all and your coming. So please help yourself to Nissu, Swedish almond cake, coffee, etc. on your way out, and mingle, please.